3 millennia ago, they burned our world to ash and left us for dead in the cold dark. They thought we were a footnote in their vast, arrogant history. They were wrong. We didn't just survive the ashes. We weaponized them. Now, we're back. And we brought the fire. The air scrubbers on the dreadnought Brimstone always smelled of ozone and stale sweat. Captain Gideon Reed sat in the command chair, his heavily calloused fingers tracing the worn armrests. The chair was a relic, stripped from a dead mining hauler 3 centuries ago, its synthetic leather cracked and peeling. He liked it that way. It was a reminder of where they came from. It was a reminder of the scrap they had glued together to survive the long dark. "Drive spooling at 90%, Captain," Navigation Officer Sarah Jenkins called out from the pit below him. Her voice was flat, professional, but Gideon could see the slight tremor in her hands as they flew across the haptic console. "Subspace manifold is stable, for now. Keep it steady, Jenkins," Gideon said, his voice a low rumble that barely carried over the omnipresent thrum of the ship's fusion core. We didn't wait 3,000 years just to scatter our atoms across the slipstream. 3,000 years. 30 centuries since the Turvan Empire decided humanity was an inconvenience. The records from the fall were fragmented, corrupted files passed down on degraded hard drives, but the core truth remained. Earth had just figured out faster-than-light communication. We had reached out, sending a message of peace, a naive greeting into the cosmos. The Turvans answered with a sterilization fleet. They didn't want neighbors, they didn't want trade. They dropped planetary fracture charges into the oceans, ignited the atmosphere, and turned the cradle of humanity into a radioactive cinder. They didn't even bother to check the fringes of the Sol system. They ignored the belters, the deep space miners, the scattered outposts in the Oort cloud. We were gnats to them, unworthy of the plasma it would cost to hunt us down. That was their first mistake. Their second was assuming that humanity, stripped of its home and freezing in the void, would simply fade away and die. We almost did. The first 500 years were a meat grinder of starvation, mutiny, and decompression. But hate is a hell of a fuel source. It burns hotter than fusion. It kept the ancestors warm when the reactor failed. It gave them a reason to carve out asteroids, hollow out rogue planets, and strip mine lifeless moons in the absolute blackness of uncharted space. Humanity didn't rebuild a civilization. We built a war machine. We spent 3 millennia turning ourselves into a species-wide blade, sharpened on the whetstone of absolute zero. "Reactor peaking," Chief Engineer David Cole reported over the comms, his voice laced with static from the heavy radiation shielding. "We're going to bleed thermal if we don't jump soon, Gideon. The heat sinks are choking." "Understood, Cole. Stand by." Gideon looked at the main tactical plot. The vast, empty grid represented the edge of Turvan space, the Sirius sector, a thriving, bloated hub of Turvan commerce and bureaucracy, completely unaware of the ghosts waiting on the other side of the veil. Gideon didn't feel a grand sense of destiny. He just felt tired. He felt the weight of 100 generations of ghosts pushing down on his shoulders, whispering demands for blood. His great-grandfather had died repairing a warp coil for this fleet. His father had died extracting tungsten for the macro cannons. Every human being alive had been born into a military caste, breathing recycled air, eating flavorless protein paste, told from birth that their only purpose in this universe was vengeance. It was a cynical, miserable existence. We had sacrificed our humanity to ensure our survival, becoming the very monsters the Turvans probably thought we were. "Fleet status?" Gideon asked. "All vessels report green," Jenkins replied. Gideon pictured them out there in the void. 4,000 ships. There were no sleek lines, no aerodynamic hulls, no shining chrome. The human fleet looked like flying anvils, brutal, utilitarian slabs of heavy armor, plating and spinal-mounted kinetic accelerators, scarred by centuries of micrometeorite impacts. They were ugly. They were perfect. "Open a fleet-wide channel," Gideon ordered. The comms officer nodded, a green light blinking on Gideon's console. He didn't stand up. He didn't puff out his chest. He just leaned forward, staring at the empty grid on the screen. "This is Reed. We are standing on the edge. You all know the history. You all know the price we paid to get here. We are not here to conquer. We are not here to negotiate. We are here to balance the ledger." He paused, listening to the hum of the ship, the heartbeat of a murdered world. Initiate jump. Space didn't bend. It shattered. The brimstone violently lurched forward as the subspace engines tore a hole in the fabric of reality. The ship groaned, bulkheads screaming under the sheer torsion of the artificial gravity well. Gideon gripped the armrests, his teeth rattling in his skull. Outside the viewport, the stars stretched into bleeding streaks of violet and red before vanishing into a sickening, churning grey. For a terrifying 30 seconds, they were nowhere. A blind leap through the screaming dark, and then, with a concussive shockwave that rattled dust from the ceiling grates, real space slammed back into existence. Aegis Prime was a marvel of Turvan engineering, an orbital fortress suspended in the upper atmosphere of a gas giant. It served as the primary listening post and customs checkpoint for the outer rim. It was beautiful, a sprawling lattice of silver spires, energy shields shimmering like spun glass, and docking rings bustling with civilian freighters. Overseer Vrel lounged in his command center, bored out of his mind. He was sipping a synthetic nectar, watching the transit logs scroll lazily down his screen. The Turvan Empire hadn't fought a real war in 1,000 years. They had sterilized all potential threats within a 500 light-year radius. Now, the military was just a glorified police force, managing trade disputes and collecting tariffs. Vrel was half asleep when the spatial anomaly sirens began to scream. The sound was a high-pitched, warbling shriek that he hadn't heard outside of a simulation. He dropped his drink, the sticky nectar spilling across his pristine white uniform. "Report!" Vrel shouted, rushing to the primary sensor console. "Was that a gravquake?" The sensor operator, a younger Turvan with pale blue scales, was frantically pawing at his interface, his eyes wide with absolute panic. "No, Overseer. Spatial tearing. Massive. I'm reading warp signatures." "A fleet? Who? The Valari merchants?" "No, sir. The signatures they're impossible. They're crude, bleeding radiation using brute force displacement. And the mass..." The operator choked on his words. "Overseer, the mass is off the scale." Outside the station's massive observation windows, the stars blinked out. Space tore open like a festering wound, and the human fleet poured through. They didn't arrive in formation. They dropped out of the tear like a collapsing avalanche of dark metal, instantly crowding the local space around the gas giant. The massive engines flared a sickly, radioactive blue, arresting their momentum with bone-crushing force. Vrel stared in horror. These weren't ships. They were mountains of iron and hate, heavily armored bricks bristling with weapon hardpoints. There were thousands of them, blotting out the light of the distant sun. "Shields to maximum," Vrel barked, his voice cracking. "Power up the plasma batteries. Hail them! Right now!" On the bridge of the brimstone, Gideon watched the silver Turvan station desperately flashing its warning strobes. The tactical display lit up with target locks as the human fleet oriented on the fortress. "Captain," the comms officer said, swiping a hand across his panel. "We're receiving a broadband transmission from the station, unencrypted, audio and visual." "Put it on." The main screen shifted from the tactical grid to the face of a Turvan. It was the first time Gideon had ever seen one alive. The alien was reptilian, with smooth blue scales and wide, vertically slit eyes. It looked terrified, but trying to project authority. "Unknown vessels," the Tervan spoke, the ship's translation software converting the clicks and hisses into flat English. "You have breached the sovereign territory of the Tervan Empire. Power down your drives and submit to scanning, or you will be fired upon. Identify yourselves immediately." Gideon let out a slow, heavy breath. "Captain?" Jenkins asked, glancing back at him. "Orders?" "Don't speak to them," Gideon said softly. "They don't deserve our words. Send them the file." The comms officer nodded, his face grim. He pulled up an encrypted partition on the main drive, a file that had been meticulously copied, preserved, and backed up for 3,000 years. It was the last transmission ever received from Earth. Across the void, Vrel waited for a response. His plasma batteries were charging, but his targeting computers were screaming under the sheer volume of hostiles. Suddenly, the Tervan comms channel crackled. But it wasn't a voice. It was noise. It was a chaotic, horrific cacophony of sound. Sirens wailing, static, the roar of atmospheric fire, the crumbling of concrete, and beneath it all the screaming, billions of voices, overlapping, pleading, burning, crying out in a language Vrel had never heard, dying in absolute terror. The audio file was compressed, distorted by time and radiation, which only made it sound more like the wailing of a demon. Vrel clamped his hands over his ear slits, stepping back from the console. "What is that? What is that sound?" Before the operator could answer, the human fleet fired. They didn't use plasma. They didn't use focused light or exotic energy beams. Energy shields were designed to dissipate heat and deflect lasers. They were not designed to stop raw, physical mass. The front line of human dreadnoughts engaged their spinal macro-cannons. Electromagnetic rails the length of a city block flared with blinding energy. 300 solid slugs of depleted uranium and dense tungsten, each weighing over 2 tons, were accelerated to 0.2 times the speed of light. They crossed the distance between the fleet and the station in a fraction of a second. There was no grand explosion, no cinematic fireball. The kinetic energy of the impact was so absolute that the Tervan energy shields didn't fail. They simply ceased to be relevant to the laws of physics. The station's lattice of silver spires shattered instantly. The solid metal slugs punched through the armored hull like bullets through wet paper, superheating the air inside to plasma. Vrel didn't even have time to scream. One moment he was listening to the dying cries of Earth, and the next he was reduced to a spray of subatomic particles as a tungsten rod tore through the command center. The Aegis Prime station, the pride of the Sirius sector, crumpled in on itself. The kinetic shockwaves ignited the station's reactors, blowing the superstructure apart in a massive, silent blossoming of debris. Huge chunks of silver metal, frozen atmosphere, and shredded bulkheads rained down into the swirling gravity well of the gas giant below. It was over in 3 seconds. On the brimstone, the bridge was dead quiet. The tactical screen updated, showing a field of expanding debris where the fortress had been. No survivors. No escape pods. Just dust. Gideon stared at the screen. He searched himself for a feeling of triumph, a rush of vindication. But there was nothing. Just the cold, metallic taste of the recycled air, and the same heavy exhaustion he had carried his entire life. Killing them didn't bring Earth back. It just made the universe a little emptier. "Station destroyed, Captain," Cole reported from engineering. "We barely felt the recoil." "Mark it," Gideon said. His voice was hollow. "Sweep the debris field. If any automated distress buoys are transmitting, let them broadcast. I want the Empire to know we're here." "Where to next, sir?" Jenkins asked, her hands hovering over the navigation controls. Gideon looked at the star map. The Sirius sector was vast, dotted with dozens of turvan agricultural worlds, shipyard rings, and populated moons. They were soft. They had spent 3,000 years getting fat while humanity spent it sharpening knives in the dark. "Plot a course for the inner system," Gideon said, leaning back into the cracked leather of his chair. "Target the shipyards at Kalen 4. We break their legs first. Then we go for the throat." The human fleet, a tidal wave of scarred iron and unforgiving physics, turned as one entity, accelerating deeper into the heart of the Turvan Empire, carrying the ashes of their dead world with them. The jump to Kalen 4 took 6 hours. Inside the brimstone, those hours felt like a slow crawl through a pressurized tomb. The ship ran hot. The fusion core, strained from the sheer mass of the jump, bled excess heat through the deck plates. The air recycling scrubbers whined a high, desperate pitch, struggling to clear the smell of hot metal and copper from the bridge. Sweat pooled in the collar of Gideon's uniform. He didn't wipe it away. Comfort was a luxury they had burned a long time ago. "Entering the Kalen system," Jenkins announced, her fingers drumming a rapid, anxious rhythm on her console. "Dropping from the warp manifold in 10 seconds. Brace for mass displacement." Gideon gripped the cracked armrests. The transition tore through his gut, a sickening plummet into a bottomless well. The bridge shrieked as real space crushed back against the hull. The tactical displays flickered, cleared, and painted a picture of absolute chaos. Kalen 4 was a manufacturing hub. A heavily industrialized world orbited by 3 massive interlocking orbital rings. This was where the Turvan Empire birthed its warships. Hundreds of half-finished hulls hung suspended in gravity cradles, surrounded by a swarm of automated construction drones. And waiting for them was the defense fleet. 70 Turvan cruisers formed a desperate blockade between the human armada and the shipyards. They were elegant, predatory things, swept-back hulls of polished iridescent alloy, humming with internal plasma reserves. They looked like predatory fish. The human fleet looked like a cinder block dropped into a pristine aquarium. "They're painting us," Lieutenant Briggs called from the tactical station, his voice tight. "Multiple targeting locks. They aren't waiting to talk this time." "Let them shoot," Gideon said. His voice was a low, steady rumble, anchoring the tension in the room. "Divert auxiliary power to the forward ablative plates. Maintain formation. Do not fire until we cross the threshold." The Turvan fleet engaged. Space erupted into a blinding storm of superheated plasma. Streams of violet and blinding white energy lanced across the void, slamming into the leading edge of the human armada. The brimstone shuddered violently. Proximity alarms screamed. The bridge lights flickered off, plunging the room into the blood-red glow of emergency backups. "Armor plating on decks 4 through 9, taking heavy thermal damage," Cole shouted over the comms, the sound of tearing metal echoing in the background of his feed. "Outer hull is melting, Captain. We're losing the sensor blisters." "Let it melt," Gideon replied, his eyes fixed on the grid. This was the brutal mathematics of human engineering. The Turvan ships relied on energy shields to deflect glancing blows. Human ships didn't have shields. They had 10 meters of solid, honeycombed titanium tungsten armor. The plasma burned. It melted the outer layers. It stripped away the comms arrays and scorched the hull black. But it couldn't penetrate the sheer, stupid thickness of the metal. We built our ships to take a beating. We built them to bleed and keep flying. The human fleet pushed through the plasma storm like a glacier sliding into an ocean. Inexorable, unstoppable. "Threshold crossed," Jenkins whispered. "All ships," Gideon said, leaning forward. "Fire for effect." 4,000 dreadnoughts opened up. The vacuum of space doesn't carry sound, but the brimstone vibrated with a concussive roar as the macro cannons cycled. Thousands of depleted uranium slugs, propelled to relativistic speeds, tore across the dark. The Turvan cruisers didn't stand a chance. Their energy shields flared brilliantly for a fraction of a millisecond before the kinetic penetrators snapped them. The solid slugs punched through the elegant, sweeping hulls, shattering internal reactors and igniting plasma reserves. It wasn't a battle. It was a harvest. Turvan ships detonated in silent, expanding spheres of blue fire. The human fleet flew directly through the debris fields, the massive armored prows of their ships smashing aside burning wreckage and drifting bulkheads. They didn't slow down. They didn't alter course. They simply waded through the destruction, their targeting computers already acquiring the next set of coordinates. "Defense fleet is gone," Briggs reported. He sounded slightly nauseated. "No coordinated resistance remaining. We have a clear firing solution on the orbital shipyards." Gideon looked at the massive rings encircling the planet. They were teeming with life. Engineers, mechanics, civilian contractors. Millions of them. "Captain," Jenkins said softly, "I'm tracking thousands of small craft launching from the rings. Escape pods, shuttles. They're trying to reach the planet." Gideon stared at the tactical display. The tiny green blips of the escape pods swarmed like panicked insects, scattering away from the looming shadow of the human fleet. 3,000 years ago, Earth hadn't had escape pods. When the atmosphere caught fire, we just burned. The ghosts in his head, the centuries of inherited rage, screamed at him to open fire with the point defense batteries, to swat the pods out of the sky, to make them feel the absolute totality of erasure. Gideon closed his eyes. He rubbed his thumb over the cracked leather of his chair. "Ignore the pods," Gideon ordered. Briggs turned around, surprised. "Sir?" "We shoot warships, Lieutenant. We shatter infrastructure. We do not shoot lifeboats." Gideon opened his eyes, glaring at the red-lit command deck. "We are here for vengeance, but we are going to do it as humans, not as monsters. Target the gravity cradles. Target the factory spines. Leave the civilian hab blocks alone if you can, but drop those rings into the atmosphere." The macro cannons fired again. The shipyards broke apart. The massive structural supports snapped under the kinetic bombardment. Gravity cradles failed, sending half-finished Turvan warships plunging into the planet's gravity well. The rings crumpled, fracturing into millions of burning pieces that rained down upon Kaelin, like a meteor shower. We didn't glass their world. We just tore out their industrial heart and let it burn in their sky. "Shipyards are offline," Briggs confirmed, his hands shaking as he cleared the targeting cues. "They're gone, Captain." Gideon felt the familiar exhaustion wash over him, heavier this time. "Spool the drives, Jenkins. We have one more stop." Turva Prime, the throne world, the jewel of the Sirius sector, hung in the void. A breathtaking orb of swirling cobalt oceans and emerald continents. It was surrounded by a defensive grid that dwarfed Kaelin 4. Dozens of orbital platforms, heavily armed defensive satellites, and a standing fleet of over 500 capital ships. When the human fleet tore out of slip space, displacing the vacuum with the violent radioactive arrival of 4,000 battered, scorched dreadnoughts, the Turvan grid didn't fire. The defense fleet powered down their plasma batteries. The orbital platforms deactivated their targeting arrays. The bridge of the Brimstone was eerily quiet. Only the rattling hum of the struggling fusion reactor broke the silence. "Are they surrendering?" Jenkins asked, leaning close to her monitor. "I'm reading 0 hostile locks. Their shields are dropping." "It's a trap," Cole growled over the engineering channel. "They want us in close. Don't trust them, Gideon." "Captain, we're receiving a hail," Briggs said. "It's a localized, tightly beamed transmission, audio only. It's coming from the planetary surface. the capital city. Gideon stared at the pristine blue-green planet. It looked so much like the old archival photos of Earth. It made his chest ache. "Put it through," Gideon said. A voice echoed across the bridge. It was deep, rasping, heavily filtered through translation software, but lacking the arrogant sneer of the commander at Aegis Prime. It sounded hollow. "I am Supreme Commander Korath, to the fleet in our orbit. We know who you are." Gideon said nothing. He let the transmission play. Our historical archives were sealed. The records of the Sol system sterilization were buried by a regime that has been dead for 2,000 years. When Aegis Prime fell, we unsealed them. We heard your transmission. We saw the coordinates. We understand. The voice paused. The static hissed over the ship's speakers. Our military is broken. The loss of Kalen IV has crippled our infrastructure. If you engage us here, you will slaughter billions of innocent lives who did not know your world existed until today. You have proven your strength. You have broken our empire. I offer the unconditional surrender of Terva Prime. Do what you will with us. But I beg you, spare the planet." The transmission cut. The bridge crew turned to look at Gideon. Every eye was on him. In the silence, Gideon could feel the weight of 3,000 oars pressing down on the back of his neck. This was the moment. The reason humanity had lived in the dark, eating scrap, breathing dust, turning themselves into iron. They could drop kinetic rods into the tectonic fault lines of Terva Prime. They could fracture the crust. They could watch the oceans boil and the emerald continents turn to ash, just as Earth had. It would take 10 minutes. The ledger would be wiped clean. Gideon looked at his hands. They were scarred, trembling slightly from the adrenaline crash. He thought about his father, dying in a collapsed mine. He thought about the generations born in the cold dark, who never saw a blue sky, who never knew the warmth of a real sun. "Sir," Briggs prompted quietly, "we have a firing solution on the capital, awaiting your word." Gideon stood up from the cracked leather chair. He walked slowly to the viewport, staring down at the beautiful, untouched world. He hated it. He hated its perfection. He hated the billions of people living down there in the light, completely ignorant of the dark. But if he gave the order, humanity wouldn't just be avenging Earth. They would be burying it forever. They would become the exact same mindless, sterile monsters that had murdered their home. "Target their orbital platforms," Gideon said, his voice hard, flat, echoing in the quiet bridge. "Target their communications arrays. Target the FTL jump gates at the edge of the system. Target the defense fleet's engine blocks." Jenkins blinked. "Captain, we're ignoring the planet." "We aren't ignoring it, Jenkins. We're isolating it." Gideon turned back to face his crew. The heavy burden on his shoulders hadn't vanished, but the crushing, suffocating grip of it had loosened. "We are going to strip this empire of its ships. We are going to destroy their FTL capabilities. We are going to take away the stars." He walked back to his chair, resting his hands on the worn armrests. "They burned our world because they didn't want neighbors," Gideon said quietly. "So, we'll give them exactly what they wanted. We'll leave them down there, trapped on their perfect world, surrounded by the wreckage of their empire. They will look up into the night sky, and they will see only our scrap metal blocking out their stars. They will remember what they did, and they will know that they only live because we allowed it." Briggs nodded slowly. "Targeting orbital infrastructure, preparing macro cannons." "Let them live," Gideon said, sinking back into his seat as the ship shuddered, preparing to fire. "Let them live and let them be afraid of the dark." The human fleet didn't glass the planet. They shattered the cage and threw away the key, leaving the ashes of Earth to settle, finally, into a cold and quiet peace. If this journey through the dark reached you, don't let it fade into the void. Hit that like button to keep the engines burning, share this transmission with your crew, and subscribe to the channel for more epic sci-fi tales. Your support is the fuel that keeps these stories alive in the endless black. Leave a comment below. Would you have fired on the planet or spared them? Let us know, and see you in the next jump.